All right, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Today, we're going kind of deep
Okay.
into some pretty heady stuff. We're looking at the connection, if there is one, between our spiritual experiences,
Yeah.
right, and our psychological understanding of ourselves. And to help us wade into these pretty deep waters,
Yeah.
our guide for this journey is going to be the work of Jordi Font.
Oh, Jordi Font.
And particularly, we're going to be looking at his book from 2015, Espiritualidad y Psychoanalysis.
Okay, so this is a while back.
Yeah, 2015. And the really interesting thing here is that he approaches, the whole vast, topic of spirituality through the lens of psychoanalysis, and really kind of zeroes in on how all this relates to, our inner world, our psychological world.
Sure.
So really exploring that personal dimension of
Exactly.
spirituality.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because even right from the get-go, Font, he kind of points out that when we're talking about spirituality, we have to consider, where's the person speaking coming from? Right. What's their background?
Yeah.
What was the context of the time that they were,
Totally.
writing or speaking or whatever.
Yeah.
So he was writing this in 2015,
Right.
within, a Western
Right.
cultural framework, which I think is helpful
Yeah.
as a backdrop as we kind of wade through his thoughts. I don't know. Have you ever just wondered, like, how the way we understand our own minds, right?
Yeah.
Might kind of influence what we consider to be a spiritual experience, or even just thought about that basic human desire for something, more profound than just what we can,
Sure.
see and touch.
Yeah, beyond the material.
Yeah, that's really the heart of what we're going to be
Like,
digging into today.
okay, so in this deep dive, what we're going to do is kind of follow along with Font's perspective on spirituality.
Yeah.
As something very, fundamental to being human.
Right.
And we're going to look at how he sees it developing over time.
Okay.
Its deep links to our unconscious mind.
Okay.
And the sometimes pretty complex relationship that it has with both, organized religion
Okay.
and how we grow psychologically as individuals. A lot to unpack.
Right. So let's dive in. Font suggests right at the beginning, he's like, okay, this human experience we call spirituality, it seems to just pop up in all cultures almost. Like it's just a natural
Kind of being alive.
Yeah.
Like an emergence of life.
Yeah.
So what's really insightful, I think, here is the way that he differentiates spirituality from religion.
Okay.
He proposes that religions are essentially the ways this underlying spirituality gets expressed, the symbolic forms it takes.
Right.
So these forms are shaped and evolve depending on the culture.
Right.
So you can think of it like, the same basic human need for connection being expressed through different kinds of community, ritual,
different structures.
different structures. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like, this is something that he kind of observed, is that, the way we in the West are kind of thinking about this whole thing has shifted a little bit, and we've moved somewhat from primarily looking at religion through a psychological lens, like Freud did in his early work, to, kind of more directly engaging with this idea.
Right. More directly with spirituality.
With spirituality itself.
Yeah, exactly.
And now here's a really fascinating thing that he touches on, is how tricky it is to even put words around spirituality.
That is tricky.
It's like the language that we often have to use involves, symbols and ideas that point beyond our everyday physical.
Yeah, it's like trying to describe, a color to someone who has never seen color before.
Right.
Our usual frames of reference just don't quite capture it.
And it's not just, it's not just about language being limited, right?
Right.
Font even brings in how, fields like quantum physics and neuroscience are expanding our understanding of reality.
Yeah, they're really shaking things up.
So, potentially giving us new ways to think about these kinds of experiences
Exactly.
that we call, spiritual.
So those fields, they're offering these new angles.
Yeah.
But Font really emphasizes that psychoanalysis, gives us this very important way to understand the unconscious emotional world that often goes hand in hand with these experiences.
Right.
So it helps us explore, how these moments resonate within our inner lives.
And then he introduces this really interesting idea of spirituality as like an evolutionary process.
Okay.
He sees it as being driven by life's fundamental tendency toward connection and unity, even from a place of diversity.
Yeah, so like everything is ultimately...
Yeah, like everything is...
leaning towards some form of integration.
Leaning towards, some form of integration.
And he also points out the kind of paradoxical nature of this spiritual reality, right? Okay. That we can have these deep experiences, these intuitions, but we can't fully grasp their ultimate essence with our, rational minds.
Right.
It remains, in many ways, a mystery that exists beyond our complete understanding.
And while this, core spiritual reality might be, something shared across humanity, he notes that, how it's emphasized can differ quite a bit from culture to culture. He mentions, for example, how, Western and particularly Christian spirituality often emphasizes, love for those who are different from us.
Yeah.
And this pursuit of like a kind of mystical union.
Yeah.
So, other cultures, while perhaps tapping into the same underlying reality.
Yeah, the same core reality, but maybe focusing on different
aspects. Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit to what Font describes as the crisis of religions in the West. So he and others have kind of raised this question, of whether a religion can really truly flourish if it loses its connection to fostering, a genuine spiritual life within its followers.
It's the idea that, the credibility of religious institutions
has been challenged when, people perceive inconsistencies or even, harmful beliefs within them. And this echoes some of Freud's earlier criticisms of religion, doesn't it?
It does. And it's interesting because Freud's critiques, while often seen as very critical of religion, actually spurred, some really valuable self-reflection and revisions within religious frameworks.
Yeah.
They forced kind of a necessary examination of certain aspects and encouraged positive changes.
So like a critical eye.
Yeah.
But it actually...
Yeah, it was critical but constructive in some ways.
Yeah. Okay, so...
But Font also suggests that one of the challenges for religious institutions can be, a kind of defensiveness, a resistance to evolving and changing.
I see.
He argues that this rigidity can actually limit spiritual freedom.
Like,
Yeah, it's like holding on to the rule book so tightly you forget the spirit behind the rule.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Yeah, and he even points to, historical examples within Christianity, like the early Christian communities, the monastic movement figures like Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola as recurring attempts to kind of get back to that essential spiritual core, to rekindle that initial inspiration.
Yeah, and it's like he's building on this idea that spirituality is not just something that cultures create.
It's not just a cultural. It's this fundamental
human need. Yeah. This inherent drive.
Right, this inherent drive beyond
our immediate experience.
He even proposes that this might be, something that sets us apart from other primates, is built-in yearning for something more.
Interesting.
So this brings us to one of Font's, central arguments, which is that the psychological basis for spiritual experience isn't primarily in our conscious, rational thinking, but rather in the emotional and feeling-based aspects of our unconscious mind. And he sees this unconscious as deeply connected to our capacity for creativity and insight. What's really cool is how he uses, Ignatius of Loyola's conversion experience to illustrate this.
Yeah, so during his recovery from an injury, Loyola kind of noticed how different kinds of books
interesting
affected his inner state.
So
like reading romantic tales, gave him pleasure in the moment, but left him feeling kind of empty afterwards. In contrast, reading about the lives of the saints, sparked this lasting desire to live a similar life and brought him, this kind of deep and enduring joy.
Okay, so the effect lingered.
Yeah, and it was these shifts in his, inner feelings that were
that was the
turning point.
Real turning point, not just the content.
Yeah. And Loyola himself recognized, these inner movements, these thoughts or spirits, as he called them, as, originating from outside.
Oh, that's your
his conscious will, essentially from his unconscious.
Right.
So he really distinguished them from the thoughts that he intentionally
Yeah. So like he was aware of this distinction.
Yeah. And this became the foundation.
Right. This distinction became very important.
Discernment.
Yeah. This is in the spiritual exercises.
Right. And Font emphasizes that these aren't, just like intellectual concepts, but rather Loyola's attempts to understand and articulate the workings of his own.
Right. It's an articulation of his experience,
unconscious
world.
Right.
And it's so fascinating because Font highlights that these rules for discernment developed way back in the 16th century. Were essentially a method for exploring the depths of the human psyche. Right. Loyola was, in a sense, mapping the territory of the unconscious through his spiritual practices, which is...
Yeah, and it's interesting because, now we're talking about the historical...
Right, let's talk...
relationship between religion and relationship. It hasn't always been.
Right. Which
a harmonious one?
Has not always been a harmonious one.
We know... Freud had a fairly critical view of religion.
It's an understatement.
Yeah, he famously viewed religion as a kind of shared societal neurosis. Yeah. Even suggesting that it was almost...
Yeah, like almost delusional.
Delusional. Now it's important.
But it's important to remember.
So remember, that this perspective wasn't universally accepted.
Of course not.
Even among his close colleagues, Figures like the theologian and psychologist Oscar Pfister, the writer Romain Rolland, and Carl Jung.
Carl Jung.
All kind of engaged with and offered...
Yeah, they push back a little bit.
Different perspectives on Freud's ideas about religion.
Perspectives.
And there's that intriguing posthumous.
Yeah, and then there's this really interesting posthumous note from Freud.
From Freud, where he refers to mysticism as... a dark perception of the realm outside the ego, the id. Right. So it almost suggests like a possible acknowledgement.
Yeah, like a hint of something.
Of something beyond his initial framework.
Yeah. And later psychoanalytic thinkers kind of move toward more nuanced understanding. Recognizing that faith and religious belief aren't necessarily signs of, psychological problems. But rather follow their own patterns of development.
Yeah, so there's this recognition of parallel but distinct paths of human experience.
Right, exactly.
Now, this brings in Thierry de Saussure's interesting comparison about the unattainable nature, the central concepts.
Central concepts in both psychoanalysis and religious experience, the unconscious, and God. So in both domains...
Interesting how both of these things are...
We're grappling with something.
Something.
That, while having a profound influence, ultimately remains our latcher, our complete intellectual grasp.
Right.
Or definitive proof, right? God is often described as ineffable, beyond human language.
Right.
And the unconscious... by its very nature, has depths we can never fully explore.
Right.
Like it's always partially hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Font points to the contributions of, European psychoanalysts like Winnicott and Bion, who offered, concepts like the transitional object.
Right.
Think of a child security blanket.
Yeah.
And the idea of a potential space, which is this realm of, imagination and play. Right. Which can be linked to our early experiences of the sacred and the development of faith.
Okay.
And then Bion's concepts around which is this kind of ultimate reality, basic trust, and even mystical experience come into play.
And let's not forget Fairbairn's object-seeking theory, which speaks to our fundamental human drive to connect with others and how that might relate to the concept of the other
in a spiritual context. Yeah, exactly.
And this wasn't just happening in Europe. We had American psychoanalysts like Karen Horney, Eric Fromm. also exploring these connections between psychology and spirituality.
Right.
More recently, thinkers like Rizzuto and Meisner have continued this line of inquiry.
And Font even mentions a collaborative work, psychoanalysis and religion in the 21st century, as a current example of this.
Right. So it's an ongoing conversation.
That's right.
Bringing together psychoanalytic perspectives on a wide range of spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of this...
So all of this kind of lays the groundwork for Font's own perspective.
Okay.
Which is firmly rooted in relational psychoanalysis.
Right.
And he finds this approach particularly valuable for understanding the psychology behind spiritual experiences and how they mature over time. So relational psychoanalysis, with its focus on, our interactions and connections with others, offers a really rich framework for understanding how our spiritual lives develop within the context of our relationships.
He really emphasizes that,
And he emphasizes that all of our experiences,
including
those that we consider
spiritual,
are ultimately lived.
Live
through our minds and our brains.
Through our minds and brains, which is a point, supported by...
supported by both neuroscience and depth psychology.
Yeah. It's not about separating...
It's not about separating
and
the spiritual, but really understanding how they're interconnected and how they influence each other.
How they're interconnected. Yeah. Okay, so...
When he draws this really fascinating parallel between... our psychological development as individuals and our spiritual maturation.
Okay.
Even though the ultimate goals might be different.
Right.
He points out that spiritual experience often uses religious symbols that have these deep roots in our early human development.
Yeah.
The symbols resonate with fundamental psychological structures and patterns that we develop in childhood.
Think about the idea.
Think about the idea of
loving parent figure.
The loving parent figure. It shows up both in our psychological understanding of security and in many religious concepts of a benevolent God.
Yeah.
So it's like this.
And he describes this as a kind of continuum with these different phases.
Different phases of development showing similar characteristics. Whether we're looking at, healthy psychological growth.
Whether it's healthy psychological growth or the journey of spiritual
maturation, as well as the challenges and the potential difficulties along the way.
And he also notes that...
And importantly,
he notes that growth in both these areas is often asymptotic, meaning that we're always developing.
Right.
But we never quite reach a state of perfect completion.
Approaching, but never
arriving.
Yeah.
It's also crucial to remember.
It's also crucial to remember, as Font points out, that this process isn't always a straight line. We can have sudden, unexpected moments of profound insight.
Yeah, like breakthroughs or something.
Yeah, like breakthroughs, a feeling of connection or deep joy that seem to arise from unconscious processing that we're not even aware of. It's like these seeds planted in our inner world suddenly and unexpectedly blossomed.
And spiritual maturation, according to Font, involves this significant shift in...
Yeah, so spiritual maturation involves this significant shift
in how we relate to the world.
Moving from primarily focusing on our own...
on our own needs and desires, what he calls egocentric relationships.
Okay, so like selfish.
Yeah, so like selfish kind of
relationships to relationships of otherness.
Is a relationship
where we genuinely connect with and value those outside ourselves.
Oh, so like really...
And this process...
taking others into account.
Often involves... working through grief and loss as we move beyond our self-centered perspective.
It's
about expanding our circle of care and concern.
Circle of care.
So within the Christian tradition, Font outlines 3 general stages of spiritual maturation that have been recognized for centuries. So the purgative way, which is about purification, the illuminative way, which is about gaining deeper understanding, and the unitive way, which is about experiencing a profound sense of connection.
Okay, so 3 stages.
Right, 3 stages.
Oh, wow.
And then he draws some really interesting parallels to key psychoanalytic concepts.
Okay, so the purgative stage.
So the purgative stage, which focuses on overcoming our selfish desires and temptations. He links to what in psychoanalysis is called the schizoparanoid position. This is an early stage of development where we might struggle with fears of rejection and even experience our internal image of God as potentially judgmental or threatening.
Yeah.
It's a world often seen in black and white, good and bad.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. So that's kind of that.
Yeah. Then the illuminative way, which is characterized by this growing awareness of our own egoism and a developing desire to know and love God and others, aligns with the depressive position in psychoanalysis.
Okay.
This is a more mature stage where we start to integrate more balanced understanding of ourselves and others.
So it's like we're starting to be able to hold both good and bad.
Yeah, hold both good and bad aspects.
Okay.
We begin to process our